It's November 26, 2012, and we are at 317 Elm Street at one of the several Ironbound Community Corporation buildings to talk with Anna Baptista. I thought I'd start by asking what your current position is at the ICC.
My current position is Director of Environmental and Planning Programs, and basically oversee all the environmental justice and community development projects within the agency.
Okay. And can you tell us about your general background, your childhood, where you grew up, and what your neighborhood was like in your schooling and so on?
Sure. I actually immigrated here with my parents and my brother when I was about 5 years old, so it was around 1981. And we moved from a little, very rural place in Portugal, northern Portugal. We lived on the farm with my grandparents, and we moved here at that time to meet my father. My father had come over first, and he was able to get citizenship and then call us over 2 years later. So I hadn't seen my father in a very long time when I was a little kid, so I was excited about seeing him. We moved here. When we first moved here, we actually lived just 2 blocks from here on Elm Street. That was my first apartment we lived at, and when we moved to this little apartment, we actually lived right next door to the Furnicola Steel Drum Factory, which is still there today. And it was an interesting place because I remember growing up as a kid, we'd play ball outside, and we'd get the ball in the street, and the factory workers would wash out these steel drums, and the stuff would just roll out into the street. This green slime would just be rolling in the street. Your ball and all your stuff would get covered in this green slime, which is funny now, but back then it was more of a nuisance. But that was sort of my earliest memories of moving here, was, coming from a very rural place to a very urban place, living in an apartment, going to the local park, Independence Park, as a child. It was a fun place to grow up, Ironbound, because you knew all your neighbors, the kids on the block all played together, you went to school together. And then when I was about in the 4th or 5th grade, my family actually bought a house on the eastern end of the Ironbound, over by Hawkins Street School, which was a little bit more, more of a run-down part of the neighborhood, kind of out on the eastern edge, a little bit more isolated, and it was a very different feel than this, sort of the heart of the Ironbound. This school was a little bit tougher, but again, it was a great growing up in the Ironbound because, again, you played outside with your friends. It was, even though it was a sort of a rougher neighborhood and you had to be careful, and you kind of watched out for each other, you knew each other. So it had its goods and its bads, and when you were growing up in it, you really didn't realize what was good and what was bad. You just kind of went along with it, and in the end, it all turned out to be a really good experience for me and my family. My family still lives down in that neighborhood, in the same house that I grew up in. And it's funny because when I first started working for ICC, I was working at the Van Buren office, which is literally down the block from the house that I first moved to, near Furnicola. So I had all these memories come back to me about the Furnicola trucks rumbling down the street. It's kind of a cool place, the Ironbound.
And so where did you go to high school?
I went to high school at Science High in downtown Newark. It was a wonderful place to go to high school. It was a small magnet school, and kids from all over Newark came to that school, and had the opportunity to really get an excellent education, really wonderful preparation, and it was a very diverse school, because it pulled children from all over the city of Newark. It made it a very rich experience, not just in the educational preparation that you got, but in the exposure that you got to all the other kids in the city of Newark. Because when you grow up in the Ironbound, you rarely leave your ward. I was in the East Ward, so all my friends and everything I knew was really in this section of Newark. And getting to go to a magnet school, you kind of got exposed to the rest of the city and other places in Newark, which was really valuable. And I was also a Ready, what they called a Ready Scholar, which meant, in the fourth grade we were selected as a class that was going to be tracked and followed and mentored and hopefully one day go to college and get a scholarship. And Ray Chambers at the time had given all this money to sort of start this program, modeled somewhat on some other programs in the U.S. and New York City, early preparation of children for college and later in life. And that also was something that followed us through into high school and then into college. And I was lucky enough to get into some, really great schools. I ended up selecting Dartmouth and was very eager, I have to say this honestly, very eager to leave Newark at that point in my life. I was very anxious to sort of get out of the city, get out of the hustle and bustle of that life, and I chose a school that was really outside the city. It was in the middle of the woods in New Hampshire. It's about as opposite of Newark as you can get, and that's sort of the way I intended it. And I spent 4 very cold years in New Hampshire, and then decided I really did like city life, and spent several more years in Providence, Rhode Island at Brown University, where I got a master's degree in urban environmental studies, and loved New England, stayed in Providence, worked in Providence for several years, and then decided to finally come back to New Jersey to pursue my doctorate at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. So that's what brought me back to New Jersey after many, many years in New England.
And now, backing up a little bit, you became involved in environmental issues, correct, well before you went off to college?
I did. I have some great memories of getting involved early, mostly as a teenager, but even before I was a teenager, with Ironbound Community Against Toxic Waste. I remember participating in cleanups with my youth group and getting really interested in sort of litter and pollution and garbage, and being very concerned about these things. Again, having lived next to Fernicola factory, and at the time you don't really know what that meant. But then when I started hearing about all these activities in the community, like the protests, for example, at the time I was pretty young, but in the 1988, 89, I started hearing about a garbage incinerator that was going to come into the community, and my family was really activated around this issue also. My parents were very concerned. We had bought the house down in the eastern end where the garbage incinerator was going to be sited, and so my whole family would actually participate in some of these protests that Nancy and Arnold helped organize. There was one protest I remember that we marched down Ferry Street, the main commercial area, with banners, and we got like face masks, and I thought it was all very exciting. I don't think I realized the severity of what was actually being proposed. To me, it was sort of like, this is an event, but it was exciting because I saw people be really passionate, and my family was very concerned, and they encouraged me to sort of get involved more. And oftentimes I would go and help translate for them. I remember going to my first public meeting about the Superfund site, the pool that was a Superfund site, and going with them and helping to try to translate for them at those meetings to tell them what was going on. So those are some of my earliest memories of really getting activated and excited about trying to make the community that I lived in better, and having a real serious sort of consciousness about, there's things going on here that are not right, and I don't know why they're not right. At that time, I really didn't have it all, sort of have a full understanding of why things were like that, but I knew that it wasn't right. So that just gave me an outlet, those protests and participating in the meetings, and that was all in a very proactive way to sort of get involved. And it was something that really formed my interest in environmental science. I went to school and I looked, I really studied environmental biology, and I really wanted to be an environmental scientist or activist, and I really stuck with that all throughout my academic career. And part of that is because of the passion that was initiated right here in the neighborhood.
So what's your sense of the broader community's involvement in these activities and these protests and marches? Was it sort of widespread, and was it, were a lot of your neighbors and friends involved too, or people you went to church with, or whatever sort of communities you organized your life around?
It's funny because now that I look back, there was a very widespread interest and involvement at different points. It seemed to wax and wane even back then. Like at the peak of when I got involved, members of my church were getting involved, and people in my school, and I would of course pull my own friends. I had my own network of friends that I'd pull into some of this stuff. So it was pretty widespread, and part of that was because there was a lot going on at that time. Late in the 1980s and early 90s, this stuff around incineration and garbage and Superfund sites, a lot of that was starting to really come out in a really big way. And so more and more people were getting activated, and those street protests are something that I've never seen at that scale really since then. So, there were points when a lot of people were engaged and involved, and there was points where like nobody, I'd go to a meeting with my parents and it'd be just us and like 4 other people. So it really varied and depended on what the issue was and what the timing of it was. But certainly there were moments in time when you saw large segments of the community very engaged and very concerned, and that whether you were like an older immigrant that didn't speak any English or a longtime resident that had lived here for 30 or 40 years, you did see that at points that everybody sort of came together, especially on fighting the garbage incinerators and some of those toxic sites.
Is there, what are the particular challenges but also the opportunities in doing this type of work in such a heavily immigrant community as the Ironbound is? I can imagine in some ways, because of language, if for no other reason, it makes things more difficult, but are there also more possibilities or opportunities because of the diversity of this neighborhood?
It's always really hard, but yes, it's the challenges of being in a community where people are vulnerable in lots of different ways, like language-wise or socioeconomic-wise. People here, just trying to make a living, just trying to survive. Some of them are trying not to even really be noticed. Different segments of this population face so many different challenges. So it's very difficult to, hey, I know you're working 2 jobs, or you're worried about how to put food on the table, but can you come to this meeting and come out and protest this thing? But in other ways, it's always reassuring to me to see that, these folks are the folks that care, because they are vulnerable, because they are so connected to their families and their networks of families and support groups. They depend on each other so much that, when there's a threat to their family's safety, to their community's health and well-being, people do respond, and they respond quite passionately. And that's a real asset in this community too. There's a font of knowledge, of concern, and in some segments of the population, even of experience with activism in different parts of their life, and maybe in different countries, that they bring to this to some of these issues. So it's difficult, but it can also be, like you said, an opportunity, because you can draw on the assets of this community, which are that people do come from places where they're very connected to their social networks and to the care of their families and their extended community. So we try as much as possible to work with folks where they are, and not to expect that people are going to come to 16 different meetings. The way we may deal with issues may not be the same way another community deals with some of these issues. The first thing we're going to do is probably not going to go hire a lawyer. But there are assets here that we can build on to fight some of these issues.
I wanted to ask you just your sort of sense of the history. So the 1980s is both when sort of you got involved, but because there was all of these environmental justice issues, coming to the fore in the Ironbound. So I guess the question is, why the 80s and why the Ironbound?
Well, you know, you probably have to ask somebody who was here way before me to figure out like the full context of the history. But from my perspective, it seemed like the 80s was interesting in that it was a time when nationally environmental issues were starting to get a different kind of attention, because all of a sudden there was a regulatory agencies that were supposed to be doing something about this. So the EPA came into existence in the 1970s. You really didn't see the EPA heavily become involved in regulations until probably the 1980s. And so it's not like these issues began in the 1980s. They just got a different type of attention, maybe starting then, that they didn't get before. And so when in 1983 or 84, whenever it was, they discovered quote unquote dioxin, well, the dioxin had been there for decades. It's just that all of a sudden the EPA got engaged and got involved and, you know, found all this stuff and knew how horrible it was for your health. And it just brought the discussion and the discourse to another level. And then at the same time, there were all these new industries that were evolving in the 80s and 90s that were supposed to be like new technology, you know, cleaner and better. You know, now it's not just this dump that you know, the landfill that you dump everything in the metal ends. Now it's like a newfangled incinerator that's like really, really great, and it's going to solve all of our problems. But to the credit of many of the activists and leaders and folks throughout the country and in this very community, they had seen this before. This wasn't the first time that technology was supposed to save us. And they were rightfully so quite suspicious and asked a lot of questions of the regulators of these industries. And that spirit of, you know, of questioning and going beyond what, you know, what the regulators say is safe, I think is a great legacy that we still hold on to today. Just because the government says it's okay, you should ask questions. You should ask why and how do you know that, and how can we be assured that that's right? So, you know, that comes from, I'm sure, decades before the 80s, having not gotten the response from the government that, you know, was sufficient.
And so as you were pursuing sort of environmental science and environmental issues, your parents were very encouraging of this, I gather.
They were. I mean, I've never really asked them what they thought of it. I don't think they knew half the stuff I was getting myself into, but I certainly came from a family that encouraged community and civic participation. You know, they definitely saw that as a benefit and as a responsibility. You know, going to community meetings, coming out to participate in things, I think they felt was an important part of coming to this country and being part of the community. Even though they didn't speak the language very well, they didn't have a lot of time or expertise, they put an emphasis on that and on us getting engaged and involved. You know, of course, my mother was like, when I was at Brown University taking soil samples and digging holes in the dirt, she's like, I can't believe that you're going to this fancy university to dig soil pits. She's like, I could have done this back in Portugal with no degree at all. This can't possibly be what you're going to spend your life doing. But I think now they see the value of it, and I think they recognize that there's lots of different things you can be besides a lawyer or a doctor, which is, I'm sure, in their mind what would have been the ideal. My brother became an actor, and I became an environmentalist, so I don't know, somewhere along the line they lost control of that.
So you mentioned incinerators, and you mentioned the pool. Could you give some more details, especially on the pool?
The pool, I remember, you know, I was kind of young, but I remember there was a swimming pool, and they were going to try to rebuild it. It was very close to our house. It was a couple of blocks from our house, so I was very interested in it as a kid because, you know, I wanted to go to the rec center and go to this new pool that they were going to build. And I guess when they started digging for the pool, they found the contamination underground and closed down the whole area, including the stadium, which was, you know, another place that community would gather, and they would see games there at the stadium. So it was a devastating loss in the neighborhood to lose the recreation center, the stadium, those were, to a community that had so precious few places to play and go with your family. When something like that gets taken away because of contamination, it's number one, it's scary, and number two, it's a real loss, because now you have even more of a selection about where you can go and play and recreate. So I remember that distinctly, because there were meetings, lots and lots of meetings that happened about what was going to happen, was the cleanup going to occur, and how long was it going to be closed for. At that time, I remember them saying, it's only going to be 4 or 5 years. Well, it took 25 years to get it really, cleaned up, which is very sad, and the stadium never got reopened. It's still to this day waiting for a cleanup. So it just shows you how long it takes once something like that happens in a community like this, for how long it takes to come back from that.
Are there other sort of specific campaigns or events that you remember?
Well, the garbage incinerator was one of the biggest, I think, campaigns, and it morphed into not just the garbage incinerator, which is the one that we have today in our backyard, the state's largest garbage incinerator. That was the one that we had a lot of focused, intense protests around. We had floats in the Portuguese Day Parade. We had our own marches down Ferry Street. I mean, I remember old Portuguese ladies chaining themselves to the fences to not let the trucks go in, to start construction of the plant. It was a really heated, ugly fight. And this community fought really blood, sweat, and tears to try to stop it, and they were overruled by very powerful actors at the local, state, and federal levels. I mean, really, we were sold out by our elected officials, and our community was basically thrown under the bus. And what's interesting to me is that a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to take former Governor Kane on a tour of our community. And he remembers our community because he flew over it and declared it a disaster area in the 1980s when he was the governor at the time of the discovery of the dioxin plant. And he was also around when they tried to site the incinerator here. And he says, when I told him statistics about the incinerator, it's the largest in the state. It takes half of its waste from New York City. It emits this much pollution every year. He was shocked. He said, oh, that wasn't supposed to happen. It was supposed to be a county facility that took a third of that garbage that you're talking about and only took the garbage from this county, and it was supposed to be very small. And, well, Governor, this is how it works, right? If you build it, they will come. If you build an incinerator that can be the largest in the state, it will become the largest in the state, and that's exactly what had happened to it. And it was only supposed to be viable for 20 years. Well, it's still around, and it's going to be around for another 20 years. So what's interesting to me about that was not that happened, was that that governor, as educated and as experienced and as much as he's seen, was shocked and surprised by that outcome of decisions and policies that were made when he was in power, and to us seemed so obvious at the time, to the residents of this community. So we still live with the legacy of a lot of these political decisions and really bad decisions that were made at that time, unfortunately. But I remember it distinctly because it was a very powerful people campaign, really from the ground up. Residents from all over the neighborhood, and also people from outside of our neighborhood came to support us.
I hope this won't sound like a stupid question, but I'd like to just hear you articulate. So what were the concerns with the incinerator? Like, what were the people afraid of?
Well, I imagine different people were concerned about different things. I mean, certainly the health aspects, the potential pollution that comes with an incinerator. Some people were worried about just having the stigma of a garbage incinerator in their backyards was going to affect their property values, affect the image of our neighborhood as just like a garbage dump. People are very proud of this neighborhood. People invest their lives in their homes and raise their children in this community. So they didn't like the idea that all of a sudden we were going to be known as like a garbage center. So that was part of it too. And the promises that were being made in terms of, who was going to pay for this incinerator, there was a lot of talk about tax money and tax dollars that were going to get spent to help build this thing. And a lot of those concerns about the financial and the fiscal aspects of that actually came to fruition. Because in the 1990s, they were going bankrupt. They didn't have enough garbage. And the taxpayers were going to have to bail them out. So it's so interesting to me how all those concerns that were very early on, almost all of them came to be true. The concerns about pollution, well, there's lots of pollution. Concerns about being a garbage mecca, well, now today we have more than 35 garbage-related facilities all concentrated in and around this area. You know, the fiscal aspects of it, you know, now we have to get garbage from all over the region, not just the county, to keep that thing profitable. So there were a lot of different issues, and I think that people at that time, you know, with very little education and very little like scientific expertise, although we did have scientists that worked with us, people just knew it wasn't right. Didn't seem right, didn't feel right, and the fact that it was, people really did feel like we were being targeted as a low-income, you know, largely immigrant community that didn't have a lot of political power, that we were being targeted. And there were incinerators proposed all over the state of New Jersey at that time. Every county was going to get an incinerator to treat their own waste. And the only two places that got an incinerator at that time were Camden and Newark. All the other incinerator proposals were defeated. So it tells you something about how these decisions get made, and it's not a coincidence, right? I mean, eventually other incinerators were built in other parts of the state, but generally that feeling of being targeted as an environmental justice community is where it bears out when you look at the facts.
And so, moving ahead sort of through your college years and your graduate school years, did you remain sort of connected and active in the Ironbound through those years? Or?
Honestly, I spent, when I was in New England, I was really in New England, and I came home to visit my family and to be with my family quite often. And I tried to stay connected to Nancy in particular and to ICC on specific issues. Like, I was away in New England when they were fighting the Riverbank Park fight, you know, trying to save Riverbank Park. And I remember coming home and getting the newsletters about it and trying to encourage my parents to get involved. And you know, I probably did several college papers or graduate school papers about some of the issues and try to help file some of those stories. But I didn't really get pulled back in actively until I came back home and was trying to finish a doctorate degree. And stay focused on that. But I was living here again, and so just by sheer fact of living back home, I got involved again. I reconnected with ICC and with Nancy, found out what was happening in the area and in the community, and volunteered my time to as much as I could. But.
And so what was the doctorate in?
My doctorate is in urban planning and public policy, but I actually ended up doing my dissertation on environmental justice policies throughout the country. Not specifically about Newark or New Jersey per se, but more on a national level and on a federal and state policy level. You know, what was being done across the country, what was working, what wasn't working. So I was still interested in that issue, and I dug deeply into it in my doctoral dissertation from a public policy and urban planning perspective and land use perspective. But I tried not to do a dissertation or a doctorate specifically about where I'm from because, you know, I have a bias. I have a bias anyway in my dissertation, but I tried not to make that my topic because I was also living it. And somewhere in the process of doing the doctorate and teaching, I had the opportunity to work part-time for ICC, do some consulting and help out with some specific projects they were working on. And that's sort of how I got pulled back in to doing work here.
And so what years about would that be?
That was probably not till 2006 or 7 that I started really getting directly involved with ICC.
Now, I may be wrong about this, but I think the first time that I saw your name or came across you, because you're kind of a big deal,
Oh yeah.
was I believe was a state level environmental group, but was specifically a Christian environmental group.
Oh, it
Is
was
that right?
Green Faith. Green
Yeah.
Faith. Yeah, Green Faith. Fletcher Harper is the director of Green Faith, and he and I were colleagues in. We were part of a national environmental leadership program together. We were both fellows in that program while I was a student at the time. I'm a doctoral student, and he was running the Green Faith program. And so the two of us connected. He was very interested in how environmental justice and communities of faith work together on issues of spirituality and social justice. And so we actually connected, and later on we've actually collaborated, ICC and Green Faith. So for example, Green Faith helped us in a lawsuit against the incinerator several years later. So that's been a really interesting collaboration because he has connections to faith groups throughout the state and also throughout the country. And so highlighting issues of environmental justice or injustice, and bringing that together with faith-based leaders who are interested in bringing their communities into this issue was a cool way for us to interact. So we worked on some projects together, and I got him more involved in some of the work here in Newark. So that's probably, how I think he actually wrote a book on, and included an excerpt about me in Newark in one of his books. That's what.
I just thought that basic approach, or combining the sort of religious aspect and the environmental aspect, just must have made sense to you given the way the community was organized here. And
Yeah, it did. I think that's when he interviewed me and when we talked about these issues. I said, I was very engaged in my local church, my church youth group, but the church itself wasn't very involved in environmental, quote unquote, environmental issues, traditional environmental issues, because they didn't see environmental justice issues as necessarily environmental issues. They were more social justice issues. They were really about our community, and it was just a different way of framing these issues, and so it was interesting to talk about how you engage different types of faith-based communities, because I think we were all working on that stuff, and our communities were interested in those things, but they just didn't see it as necessarily what most people consider environmental.
that's interesting. It gets framed differently for different communities. Yeah. So when you came back to the Ironbound, started working at ICC, what were some of the big campaigns or issues at that time? Were there still issues left over from your previous experience with the ICC before you had gone to New England, or were there all new sets of issues?
Surprisingly, there was a lot of leftover issues. Some of these issues, not surprisingly, do not go away, or they morph into other problems. So the incinerator issue was still an issue. It was an issue in the sense that it was still a polluting presence in the community, and I think what changed is ICC's role had evolved, so yes, we were still an activist organization. Protests were still needed in the streets, but there was also a need to engage at multiple levels and at multiple scales now, because the issues were becoming increasingly complex and sort of interlinked. So for example, the fight on the Riverfront Park, that fight was about land use, right? Conflicting land uses. But it was also about our community's ability to proactively engage in the land use process and in development in our community. So it wasn't just like fighting the things you didn't want. It had to be about imagining what you wanted and figuring out ways to get that. So you weren't always fighting the things you didn't want, right? But that's really difficult to do. It's easy to say, but it's difficult to do, especially when you're very little resources. You're in a community that's difficult to, organize around all these complex issues. So it requires a level of organization and infrastructure to be able to plan ahead and do the visioning and then do the advocacy and then do the policy work, develop resources to get to implementation, and it takes a lot of time. So some of the new things that the ICC was getting involved in were things like planning, community-based planning, community-based advocacy. How do you fight for the development of new green spaces and the protection of existing green spaces? How do you get involved with state level and federal level policymaking that will make industries like the incinerator industries more responsible, better neighbors, less polluting? You know, how do you stop future facilities from coming into the community? So it was really the role of ICC as sort of agitator and activist was still present, but it also had evolved other elements and that were required to be able to forge ahead. And I found that very exciting and very interesting because now there's lots of different ways you can engage the community, both proactively and also sometimes you have to be reactive. You still had to have that, but so we were still fighting. You know, even as of last year, we were fighting incinerator proposals. Medical waste treatment facilities. These things will always come, and you always have to be ready. So you always have to organize your community. You always have to be in the community and of the community to be able to react to those things. But there's a lot of work being done now on the other end, which is the proactive stuff. Finding green development opportunities that we can attract here, doing farmers markets and community gardening, doing environmental education and stewardship. These are very promising and reinvigorating things too, because it helps replenish you, and so you're not always in that reactive fighting mode. It gives the community an opportunity to actually enjoy and think about the future.
So you said, we'll wrap it up. You had said before that your sense of the 80s was in part that there was a new federal regulatory body that was bringing these discussions and these issues to the fore, providing the opportunity for you and others in the Ironbound to do it. What's your sense of the sort of larger context around environmental issues now? Is it more difficult to be dealing with these issues now, or are there?
I mean, it's more complex, I think, now. I think, yes, we have more regulatory oversight, but at the same time, we're basically in the same place we were in the 1980s in terms of being able to have real control and oversight over some of these industries, because the Clean Air Act today is the same Clean Air Act you had in 1970s with some amendments, but the basic rules of the game are the same. And so being able to really talk about the complex nature of what we face, we know a lot more about it. We know a lot more about the cumulative impacts of all this toxic soup that is concentrated in our communities and is the result of decades and centuries of land use planning and environmental regulation or deregulation. But how do you untangle all that and figure out a way to make our communities healthier places to live and safer to live? I don't think we've really figured that out. We have some band-aids here and there and some issues we're trying to resolve, but the issue is so complex, and that complexity sometimes paralyzes us to do anything. So we need to innovate and continue to push the envelope. And at the end of the day, it's still about organizing and building power within your communities. Because if your community doesn't have power, doesn't have voice, then no matter what the solution is, you're never going to get there, because you don't have an activated, organized group of residents who are ready to fight for that solution and to push for it. No one's going to give us the solution. We really have to fight for it. So it's more challenging and more complex, but at the same time, I think we're evolving. We're figuring out ways to get there together.
It sounds like you have your work cut out for you, so
No.
we'll let you get back to it.
Thank you so
very
much, Mark.
much.